Many authors, they write because they know something. I write because I want to know something.
Nir, I'm so excited you're here. You've obviously written two incredible books that have absolutely crushed it, and it's a delight to be able to pick your brain. And just for anyone who's new, this is part of the Write Useful Books authors community. We try to help each other out, make a useful book, right? And occasionally we get the pleasure of having someone like Nir to come in and teach us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks everyone for coming.
You told me that your life plan is to write a book every 5 years. I love that. It sounds like a great way to live a life. Would you talk a little bit about how you think about the process of writing and where books fit into your life?
I didn't intend to be an author. I was a journalism co-major in undergrad, and I didn't realize I enjoyed writing until fairly late in life. I'm actually dyslexic, and so I was always a very, very slow reader, and English isn't my first language. We spoke Hebrew at home. So it's very strange that I ended up doing this as a career, because my grades in school, my worst grades were always in English language arts. In my public school, they didn't have enough teachers, and so they asked the coach of the football team. Football was a really, really big deal where I grew up in Central Florida. It was like God, football, everything else. And because that was such a big deal, like the football coach got to do whatever he wanted. They didn't ask him to do anything except, please, coach, can you teach just one class for us? And that one class was a class I was in. And all we did was read Time magazine. And I'm kind of dating myself here, but I went to high school before the internet. And so Time magazine was like a really, really big deal. And my favorite part around reading Time magazine was the last page of Time magazine always used to have the op-ed. And I remember these essays were phenomenal. And that really started my love of that format of writing. And I grew up in a very conservative part of Central Florida. I had this really weird name. I felt like an outsider. There was like one other Jew in my school, let alone anybody from Israel or with a strange sounding name. And so I remember reading these articles with the class and then discussing them and seeing people's minds change and expand. And through that discussion facilitated by these articles, people who were set in their ways would take a different viewpoint sometimes. I just thought that was incredible. And so that was the kind of writing I really fell in love with, was short form, 500 to 1,000 words, a persuasive essay. Then I went to undergrad. I explored a journalism career. And I remember they had a sign on the board of all the salaries for different journalism jobs. So here's what TV journalism pays. Here's what newspapers pay. I remember thinking that's crazy. You can't make a living on that. And so I decided not to go into journalism. I went into business instead. I had to pay some bills. And so I decided to become a management consultant, and I did that for a couple of years. Didn't like that. Started a solar energy company. Moderately, I liked that. We were very fortunate. We got into it very, very early, and like before Solar City and any of those guys, and our timing was really good. So managed to sell that company, and then went to business school and started another company. And only after that company was acquired and I had some wherewithal to do what I wanted to do. I'm not religious at all, but I remember I said a little prayer and I said, please let me find a profession I enjoy, because I didn't like management consulting. I didn't really like being a CEO. It was really, really hard work. And so I thought, you know what, let me take some time off. I'm just gonna write. I always like to write. I'm just gonna play around for a little bit before I have to go get a real job again. And writing basically persuasive essays from what I was interested in learning about became my career. I didn't plan it that way, but it just worked out that way. So my guiding principle, you asked, kind of what drives my writing. I always try and follow my curiosity. Many authors, they write because they know something. I write because I want to know something. And it's that spark that, I got to get to the bottom of this. What's the answer? That is the variable reward, if you will. I write a lot about the psychology of intermittent reinforcement and what makes things engaging and habit forming. And writing, I don't think it's a habit because it's too hard to be a habit. It can pull you, right? It can pull the author into something that you just want to do. And that spark, that beautiful flame of curiosity is something I've always tried to follow. So when writing gets hard and I'm kind of stuck, I always repeat that in my head of follow your curiosity.
That curiosity, I sometimes feel like it's a bit of a trap, because I fall in love with a new idea I want to explore and learn more about. And then 3 months later, I'm in the sunk cost fallacy. I'm like, wow, I just spent 3 months on this. I got to finish the book now. Got to get it out the door.
Oh my goodness. If I could show you how much I didn't publish. I've published 2 books now and countless articles, but if you saw the junk I didn't ever put out in public, it's probably 10 times what I published.
I wrote one not very good book, and fortunately my boat sank and the only manuscript was on the boat. So I have a good excuse for not finishing that one.
Oh my goodness, that actually, that's real.
Yeah, in the French canals, bringing my boat through France.
I write books for me. Okay. Like, here's the dirty little secret. I don't care if y'all read them because I wrote them to answer a question I'm struggling with. And to me, it's very analogous actually to starting a business, because I always tell startup entrepreneurs, if you are starting a company because you want to make a lot of money, like, you're bad at math. If you're writing a book because you want to be a New York Times bestseller, you don't understand basic arithmetic because the odds are not stacked against you. They're almost guaranteed to not play out the way you expect from a sales perspective, just statistically speaking. Commercial success is a really bad reason to start a business. It's a really bad reason to write a book. The reason you start a business or write a book is because you believe like it cannot not exist. It wills itself to exist in the world for you. All advice is autobiographical here. I'm not saying this is the end all be on. This is just what works for me, which is finding a question I want to get to the bottom of for my satisfaction. So when I have a problem in my life, first step is I'll think about it. Okay, maybe I'll write a little bit about it just to help myself structure my thoughts. Then if I haven't solved the problem, I'll talk to my wife or a good friend. Then if I haven't solved the problem, I'll read books on the topic. And only then, like once every 5 years or so, if I still haven't figured out the answer to the problem I'm trying to struggle with, okay, now I'm going to write a book about it. Now I'm really going to go deep. And that's what's happened twice in my life. When I wanted to write a book about how to build habit-forming products, I didn't find such a book. And so I wrote and figured it out. And the same goes with becoming Indistractable. When I wanted to figure out how do I fight distraction in my own life, and I didn't find a book that gave me advice that wasn't much better than, turn off all your devices. Well, that's not very helpful, right? Like, stop using the internet. Like, oh, okay, thanks, stupid. That's really not helpful. So I really wanted to write a book that I found was practical. And so that's why I decided to write Indistractable.
You're now traditionally published with a big publisher, but you didn't start out that way. Can you talk a little bit through how you built the leverage to be taken seriously as a first-time author and how your experience shifting and working with them has been?
Hooked didn't start out originally as a book. I started blogging and writing those persuasive essays, 500 to 1,000 words. And I think what was good about that process was that it's very manageable. To sit down and say, I'm going to write a book, whew, that's a trip. That's really hard work. But yeah, I can write 500 words, maybe even 1,000 words. But you know what? If you do that just every week for 1 year, guess what? You got a book, right? How easy is that? You need about 30,000 words. So let's say you get 50,000 and now you get to trim a bunch. It's not that bad. And that's what happened with Hooked. I just blogged my way into a book. And once in a while, I would give a public talk or something, or do some consulting work. And somebody would say, hey, we like your methodology. We want to give this to people. Can you give us something we can hand out? And so I said, sure. Okay, I'll put this together into a PDF. Maybe it'll be, 15 pages. Well, I didn't realize how much work I'd collected over the years. Might as well make a book out of it. And it ended up being like 250 pages. So I decided to put it into KDP, the self-publishing platform that Amazon has. And it started getting some reviews. And in fact, many of them were 5-star reviews. That's when I got a call from an agent, my current agent, Christy Fletcher, who I've been with since 2012. She called me up and she said, I think this is a pretty good book. It looks like you're getting a lot of good reviews here. Why don't we do a book together? And I said, okay, sure, no problem. Let's work on the next book together. At some point, I'll write another book, because this one is just, I just kind of put it together real quick. And she says, no, this one, we should go out and sell this one. So we did. And it turns out that we had a competitive bidding process for it. And even though it was self-published, which I thought would be kind of disqualifying, it turns out that it de-risked the book for the publishers. I didn't have to sell the book. The readers were saying it was good. So they didn't have to take my word for it. They could just look on Amazon. And then Portfolio ended up buying it. And then we were off to the races. And today we've sold 500,000 copies of each. Hooked has sold 500,000 copies. Indistractable just passed 500,000 copies in less time. And my email list today is about 125,000 people. The methodology, I wish I could say there was some easy trick to it, but it's pretty simple. It's just keep writing, keep publishing. And if you do that, as long as I've been doing it now since 2012, it builds up momentum. And so it becomes easier and easier. So Indistractable was a breeze, right? I didn't have to hard sell publishers because they knew me already. It's way easier to get your second book deal if you've already done one. And that book was bought by Audible, was the primary buyer. And then we had the print rights go to a few other folks, Ben Bella in the US and Bloomsbury in the UK.
I absolutely love hearing that you had no platform when you began, because it's easy to look at a successful author and look at their current platform and then say, well, of course it's easy. Look at their platform, but you built that alongside your writing. Your platform didn't enable your books to succeed. Your book succeeding created your platform.
The best piece of advice I can give an author is you've got to start collecting emails. Okay. Like, if you're not collecting emails right now, do it today. Right? Like you have to collect emails because emails, like social media, it's all nice and dandy, but you are at the whim of their algorithm, right? So if you're trying to build your audience by building a big Facebook following or Instagram following or TikTok following, you don't have direct access. Whereas when you have an email address on your website that says, if you want to follow my writing, please give me your email and you'll hear from me when I write something new, you're basically building your fan base and you're making it incredibly easy to have a successful book launch because you got a list. If you look at Atomic Habits or Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck or my book, it was really about building a big list. And then, hey, if a small percentage of that really big list buys the book, it's simple at that point. But to get to that point, you just need to write consistently and make sure that people who like you. And what I love about this business is a few things. One is you're helping people who genuinely like your writing connect with you. What could be better than that? Like, here's some free work that I did that you get to consume. I'm not charging anything for it. And then it's not competitive. It's not zero sum. So when I was at my previous companies, it was, well, if we got a deal, that's because our competition lost one. No, with being an author, what I love about this business is that it's non-zero sum. So if Rob writes a book, awesome. I want to help Rob because they're going to buy Rob's book and my book and James's book and everybody's book, right? And so authors tend to help each other, which is really, really nice. Super common problem. I feel it all the time. Writing is never easy, right? Like I wrote today for a couple hours. It was a grind. So I think the first step is to not fool yourself into thinking that it should ever become easy. And this is all for nonfiction. Dissolve this notion that it's somehow going to become a habit. You know, I write about habits. I've studied them for over a decade. I will tell you, writing is not a habit. People say, oh, I want to get into the habit of writing. No, then you don't understand what a habit is. A habit is a behavior done with little or no conscious thought. How do you write without thinking? Not nonfiction, maybe stream of consciousness. You can't write without thinking about it. You have to think about it. It's deliberate practice. It's hard work. So the first step, I think, is dissolving the idea that it should be easy. It's not meant to be easy. It's never going to be easy. You know why? Because that's what makes this a rare skill. That's exactly what makes us successful and why everybody can't do this, because it's hard. So that's a good thing, that if you're able to do it, if you've ever found pleasure in writing, in that hard pleasure, that difficult pleasure, great, you have a very rare skill. And that's a blessing, right? But don't think that, oh, if it's hard, then I'm not a real author, right? Everybody struggles with how difficult writing is. So that's one thing. I think another thing is that, this is what Indistractable is all about. So if you haven't had a chance to check it out, I encourage you to, but it's really about these 4 steps of, number 1, mastering the internal triggers. And this can be used with any distraction, whether it's, oh, I'm on a diet, I don't want to eat that chocolate cake, or I'm trying to stop smoking that cigarette, or I really wish I could stay focused and do my writing as opposed to checking email or doing work or checking Facebook or whatever the case might be. Number 1 is master the internal triggers. That the number 1 source of distraction begins from within. It's not the beeps or boops. It's not your cell phone. It's not even your kids or your coworkers. The number 1 source of distraction is up here. It's boredom, loneliness, fatigue, stress, anxiety, uncertainty. Those internal triggers are by and large why people get distracted. So we have to master those internal triggers or they become our masters. So having the skill set, the arrows in your quiver ready to go, so that when you feel that discomfort, that emotional discomfort, boredom, anxiety, whatever the case might be, you know what to do with it, as opposed to what most people do. They escape it. They escape it with a drink. They escape it with a TV. They escape it with Facebook. They escape it with email. That's the critical skill that authors have to learn. All of us have to learn to stay indistractable. Number 2 is making time for traction, right? Making time for that thing. So if you just put on your to-do list, write today or finish a chapter, it ain't going to happen. It's got to be on your schedule. It's okay if it's once a week. You don't have to write every day. It's okay if it's 30 minutes a day. It doesn't matter. Whatever the case might be, have that time in your schedule, not on your to-do list, in your schedule. It's called making an implementation intention. When is it going to happen? Where are you going to be when that writing actually occurs? It's got to be on your schedule. It's not going to happen if it's not. That's the difference between an amateur and a professional, as Stephen Pressfield says. The third step is to hack back the external triggers. So this is where we remove all of those pings, dings, and rings, all the potential outside distractions. And then finally, the fourth step is preventing distraction with pacts. Pacts are these pre-commitment devices that we can use, that when the other techniques fail, this is the last line of defense. When people say, oh, I really struggle with the motivation to finish editing my book or whatever the case is, I tell them about how I had this same struggle with writing Indistractable. That because Hooked was successful, I had all these new distractions, speaking gigs and consulting engagements, great stuff. But all this stuff was taking me away from what I really wanted to do and what made me successful, which was to write. So it was really hard for me to finish my second book until I discovered in the research this technique called making a pre-commitment. And I used this technique to help me finish my book. And here's what I did. So after 4 years of research, I just needed to write the damn thing. And so I made a bet with my buddy Mark, and I told him, Mark, if I don't finish my manuscript by January 1st, I am going to give you $10,000. Let me ask you, do you think I gave him the $10,000? Or do you think I finished my manuscript? Of course I finished my manuscript, right? Tell me, if you came up with an amount of money that is going to hurt, are you not going to finish? Of course you're going to finish. So we've established you can finish. The question is, how do we set up the structure to help you achieve that goal? So it's really about those 4 steps: mastering internal triggers, make time for traction, hack back external triggers, and prevent distraction with packs. That's your formula.
I get this mental hang up where I hesitate to publish something that then I feel like is going to be redundant if it goes into the book that I'm working on. How do you balance that? Or am I just in my own head too much and need to get over it?
Super common concern. Very easy question. Don't worry about it. Why don't worry about it? Because to you, this stuff becomes super familiar. And you're like, oh, I fired that bullet already in my blog, and everybody will read my blog and my book. May we be so lucky. The fact of the matter is, people are busy, right? Maybe they read your blog. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they read it 2 years ago. They probably forgot it. Like, tell me the core thesis of any nonfiction book you read 3 years ago. Can you tell me anything about it? Like, people forget it. So it's going to be new the next time they read it. Maybe it'll jog their memory a little bit. It's going to be a very small proportion of your blog subscribers. And in all the time that I've written, I think Indistractable has like over 1,000 reviews. Hooked has over 2,000 Amazon reviews. I think there's actually only one that I've ever seen where somebody said, oh, this stuff was on his blog. So for the vast majority of people, and in fact, it serves the opposite function. It really helps you. Why? Because you're showing people your best stuff. You're giving them an incentive to come along with you for that ride. And so even if you publish an idea here or idea there, what they're really paying for with the book is, one, the structure, right? So if you write a little blog post or one idea, how does that fit into the bigger picture? That's what you get with the book. And two, this cannot be overemphasized. People want to own something. People think that when they buy a book, they like suddenly have the knowledge. Of course, they don't, because the vast majority of books, let's face it, people don't read, but there's something about, I have it, right? Like, I own it. And so it's not necessarily something that loses value just because they may have heard an idea or two previously.
I started beta reading quite early on my current book when it was still a true mess. I wanted to see how early I could begin beta reading. And a lot of the early reviewers, when the book was finished, they said, I read an early version. I read a version midway through, and now I've read the finished product. And they actually said they got different value and new value at each stage. And I think when you look at a blog post, you go, oh, the topics are the same, but there's actually a lot of craft in the finished book and the cohesiveness of a product that brings someone on a knowledge journey from start to finish. It's different than a bundle of blog posts. And I wouldn't underestimate the craft that goes into that final thing and the cohesiveness.
And I know quantitatively that this works. One of the things I did on both books, which frankly, I don't understand why every author doesn't do. Here's what I did. Part of the reason that Rob and I got connected is that Rob built this platform that I had to build myself with Google Docs. So I had, both with Hooked and Indistractable, what I call a contributor program, that if you signed up for this contributor program, you got access to this gigantic Google Doc with my book in it, that if you gave me feedback, if you just, read whatever you can of the book and leave me some comments or find some typos or tell me what you think of the book, inside this Google Doc, I would put your name in the back of the book. And so every single print edition of Hooked and Indistractable, you will see about 500 names in the back of the book. And guess who not only was first to buy the book, but also tell their friends about the book because, hey, my name's in it. It was these 500 evangelists. Even though they read it before, they really wanted the book. One, okay, I'll grant it to you, their name was in it. That's exciting to a lot of folks, but also they were part of it. They helped me along this journey. And of course, I thanked them in the book as well. But it was amazing to see how many people were so happy, not only to help, I'm asking them to be my editors. This is typically something you have to pay people for, right? And they were happy to do it. They felt honored to do it. We, in fact, had an application because we didn't want more than 500 people. And people were so honored to help, and they became the evangelists. They became the folks to tell everyone else about it.
I saw the exact same for mine. All of my earliest reviews came from my beta readers. It's amazing how supportive people are. It's a bit of exposing weakness, right? You're saying, hey, come behind the scenes and see how this is made. And it's a little embarrassing. Some people don't get it. They go, ooh, this isn't written very well. It's like, yeah, it's the first version, right? Well, this is part of the process.
And the book got so much better. I can't even tell you. When you stare at a manuscript for months and months, there's some things you just can't see. And it's one thing if your editor at the publisher says, hey, I don't like this. Okay, well, it's your opinion versus my opinion. But when 20 of your readers say this doesn't make sense, okay, well, now you got to listen. So that was just super helpful.
One of the authors in our writing group, Brian, he was really excited about his book and he started writing. And then he hit a bit of an impasse because he's like, I'm done writing it and it's only 12 pages long. And I don't think that's going to look good between covers, you know? And he goes, well, let's try beta reading it anyway. And he actually was brave enough to put it out there despite thinking it wasn't a book. And what happened is he got so many questions from those early beta readers. They said, hey, can you explain this? Can you give an example of this? By the time he was done, suddenly he was close to 100 pages. And he's like, ooh, I bet after another round of beta reading and the next set of questions, I'm going to have a book here. So I love the attitude you're talking about, which it's very reader centric. It's very reader empathetic. It's like, what do they need to know? And how can I help them get there? And anything they don't need to know is just wasting their time. It's harder, I think, than just going into the tank for a year and writing in private, because you got to put yourself out there when it's still a mess.
It's very similar to the process that I use around blogging out the book, right? When you blog, you're going to hear feedback, right? You're going to hear good, bad, and ugly. And most importantly, you hear, well, what about, or can you elaborate upon? This is really the difference between the articles that never make it into a book and what actually does become the book. It's the ones that people say, hey, that was a really good post, but did you ever consider such and such? Or what about this case? And then that becomes the path that, as long as it's interesting to you, you can continue to follow your curiosity and just keep writing and writing. One technique that I think really improved my writing was to workshop it. This was an iterative process. I made it into a class that I actually taught at Stanford for many years. And seeing the student reactions to what I was teaching and figuring out where they maybe didn't land, or where they went over people's heads, or where people couldn't figure out how to make it practical, was wonderful. So I did that same thing with Indistractable. In that case, I wasn't teaching anymore at Stanford. I was teaching it at corporate engagements, or sometimes just webinars or free events, and having that ability to actually interact with people, calling together 10 of your readers and saying, hey, I'm going to teach you. And today it's way easier than when I did it, because you can do it over Zoom for free. If you can gather together 10 people and teach it live, like with slides, that's a great way to make sure it's practical.
I will do that. Thank you so much.
I do a lot of one-on-one coaching alongside writing a book for free. So I basically put out a call where I say, hey, I'm researching this book. It's meant to help you understand this thing or solve this problem. I would love to just help you think through it or help you work through it. And obviously this is very costly in terms of time, because you're spending a lot of time with an individual. But I found getting 2 people, alongside writing a book, who I can really help over weeks and months. Because sometimes I say something clever and people go, yes, that's brilliant. I'm definitely going to do that. And then I check a week later and they go, I didn't do that at all. And it's like, well, why not? That wasn't their mistake. That was my mistake in the way I delivered the information and the next steps. And so with these small numbers of people who I follow and try to bring all the way to the end result that the book is promising, it really helps me debug where I've said something that sounds great in theory, but doesn't actually work. But it does take time, but it's also a pleasure. And I've made some great friends that way.
Thank you. Rob, Nir mentioned a platform that you have for feedback or something? Yeah,
it's called helpthisbook.com. And it's built for beta reading. It's meant to help you get bigger picture and more negative feedback, which it hurts, but that's what you need.
Oh, it's exactly what I need. Thank you.
Yeah.
I would have killed for that. Just so you know, Google Docs was a nightmare.
Google Docs is great up to a point, but once you've got 50,000 words and 500 comments, it gets a little bit tedious.
The best structural tool is a picture. And that's something that I've used in both my books. In my case, it just happens to be a 4-part model. But the idea is that if it's simple enough to explain, it's simple enough to share. By the way, I will tell you, coming up with the picture in both my books took me as long as writing the book. It was very difficult to do. It looks easy, but actually, especially with Indistractable, I'm particularly proud of that. So Indistractable, it's a model where basically you have traction, which is the opposite of distraction, right? So traction and distraction. Traction is any action that pulls you towards what you say you're going to do. Distraction is anything else. And then external triggers and internal triggers. So the external triggers are the things, the pings, dings, and rings in your outside environment, the things that lead you towards distraction. The internal triggers we talked about earlier, all the things in your head that can lead you towards distraction. Those 4 steps and that picture of arrow, 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 that took me longer than writing the book. But once I did that, writing the book was easy, because that became the framework. That became something that I can teach. Look, I just told you all in 30 seconds. And hopefully, if people read the book and if that's all they take away from it, because knowledge decays very, very quickly. We are meticulous about all the studies and the details. People remember maybe 1% of what we wrote after a year, if we're lucky. But a picture, that visual image of, that's what that book was about, that lasts a long time. And the way I picked this up, by the way, when I was running my last startup, somebody came into the office and said, I read this interesting blog post, and she drew a picture on the board. And I remember that so vividly. And I said, that's genius, right? What a way to spread an idea. So if you can visualize it in some form, again, it's simple enough to understand, simple enough to share. It's really hard because the publishing industry is a fat head industry, meaning like the vast majority of books are bought by a small percentage of the population. I don't know if folks know this, but it's something like 20% of readers buy 80% of the books. So it's the kind of readers that read a book a week, right? That's really the 80% of books that are sold. Every once in a while, you'll get a Sapiens or an Atomic Habits that even non-readers buy, but that's their like one book of the year. They don't move the books. The people who really move the books and influence others are the people who read like a book a week. The problem with that fact in our industry is that it's really hard to surprise those people because they've seen it all. Like if I read about the marshmallow test study one more time, like I'm going to barf. Like how many times am I hearing the same studies again and again? So particularly what I do, it's really tough. You read original research, right? You read the studies and you keep up to date with what's new, and that becomes the fodder. And then I think when I was a journalism co-major, the 6 steps to becoming a writer was read, write. So by reading a lot, you collect a lot of these anecdotes. Sometimes I can't help myself, but I try not to read popular books, like reading older books that weren't super successful, but maybe are hyper targeted to the topic. Sometimes, most of the time people don't make it past page 100. And a lot of times there's great stuff in the rest of the book. So if you can kind of, dig out those stories and anecdotes. And then from a very like nuts and bolts perspective, I have a huge Evernote file. So every time I see any kind of story, I tag it and I put it inside Evernote, and that becomes very helpful. So if I want to write a blog post about, I don't know, psychological reactants, I have a folder of like all these interesting stories that as I've read over the years, that might make for a good story someday. 99% of them I'll never use, but hey, once in a while, it becomes a good well to dip into.
It looks like you spent a lot of effort on the digital add-ons and bonuses. Indistractable has a whole workbook, an 80-page workbook. That's not as much work as a book, but that's a lot of work. And you've created worksheets, there's guides, there's tutorials. You've really gone the extra mile to help people apply this stuff to their life. Has that been impactful? Is that something every author should be doing? Because almost nobody does it. What was it like?
I'll tell you a little bit of a secret that the workbook comes from the book itself. At the end of every chapter, with both my books, I have a remember this section. And I do that just out of compassion for my reader, because being dyslexic, reading slowly, I would hate getting to the end of a chapter and being like, wait, well, what was the point? What am I supposed to take away from this? And at first I thought it was like, I must be dumb as a reader, because that's how you feel at the end when you're like, I just read 30 pages and I don't know what to take away. And then now that I'm on the other side, I'm not just a reader, but I'm a writer. So as a gift to the reader, I always summarize the chapter so that even if they just want to flip to the back and be like, okay, what's this chapter about? Do I really need to read it? Hey, here are the 4 or 5 key takeaways. And also I have a section that says, do this now. I didn't do it with Indistractable, but I did it with Hooked. It says, do this now. Like literally right now, do this. And so Indistractable is the takeaways extracted, plus the do this now that we didn't end up putting in the final manuscript. The publisher didn't like it, so we put it into the workbook. Instead, it started getting too long. So there's a few reasons. So we had the material already, so we put it in the workbook. And the workbook serves a few purposes. Number one, even if you don't buy the book, you're going to benefit from the workbook. You essentially have the Spark Notes in the workbook. So, some people don't want to take the time. They're never going to buy the book. At least there's some value that they're going to get out of the workbook as well to start them on the journey. The second thing that it does is that even if you buy the book, I've sold 500,000 copies of each of my books. I don't have 500,000 people on my email list because the vast majority of people won't come back. But if there's an incentive to come to my blog, if there's an incentive now to have a relationship with the reader, to get the workbook, subscribe to the blog, that becomes the incentive to have a personal connection so that when I write book number 3, 4, 5, and 6, now we have a direct line of communication.
It's one of the top 2 lead magnets I've seen for books. The ones that really stood out to me were James Clear's for Atomic Habits, where it's like you're building habits every day. So get my reminders about habits every day. It's so aligned with the book's value prop. Another was Ryan Holiday's for his Stoic books, where he's like, I'll send you a daily Stoic meditation. You're reading this, like it's perfectly in line. And so is yours. It's so aligned with the book's value prop. And what I've always struggled with is when I try to come up with them, I'm like, well, this is nice, but it's unrelated. And I think the magic of what you've done is you're like, hey, if you care about this enough to buy the book, you clearly also want this extra thing. It's only going to help you.
Any kind of bonus content, anything that maybe didn't make the cut in the book, anything that can help the user on that journey, all those things can be great content upgrades with my two books. So Hooked was written for a smaller audience. I only write for product people. So marketers, entrepreneurs, people building primarily tech products. So very small, highly engaged audience, whereas Indistractable is for potentially everyone, but many times it's so broad that it's harder to reach. So I think I would start always by going for the more engaged audience. Well, first of all, start with whatever's fun, right? Follow the curiosity. If it's fun to write in Spanish, write in Spanish. If it's fun to write in English, write in English. But if you're thinking, okay, both are equally fun, always go for the more engaged audience first. Hooked was a much easier crowd to write for because I know where they go. I know what conferences they attend. I know what publications they read. I know where they hang out. It's very easy to find people who build tech products, right? There's certain Facebook groups. It's very easy to find them. And it was very easy to get adoption among that community. Now, then the book kind of took on a life of its own and expanded beyond that community. But starting with that community was really easy. In many ways, Indistractable was a bit more difficult because it was broad, because it wasn't for a very specific niche. It's for everybody. So it's a little bit harder to find that community. There's some other things I did by segmenting the market, but I would say always write for the more engaged audience first. If you're writing a book for the right reason, then you can't fail, because worst case scenario, hey, you got the answer to your question, right? Like I think that's the best reason to write a nonfiction book, is that you just want to chase down this question to your satisfaction. But commercial success, right? If that is interesting to you, I think building an audience cannot be overstated. It used to be like, oh my goodness, Portfolio or Random House or somebody was going to buy your book and then they took care of the rest. That is not the case anymore. Authors have to bring their own audience. This notion that if you just sell the book to a publisher and you get your advance, they do the rest, that world is long gone, because people overwhelmingly buy books on Amazon and Audible. It's amazing with audiobooks. The vast majority of my first book were print books. And with Indistractable, it's the exact opposite. The vast majority are audiobooks. Audible has just gone crazy. And it's wonderful because it's turned a lot of people who wouldn't consume books into people who consume books. They listen to books. It's wonderful. And the economics are great too for the authors. It just reemphasizes that it's not like it used to be where somebody would walk into a Barnes & Noble or a Borders and see your book. That's not how people buy books anymore. So you have to bring your own audience. So anything you can do to start growing that audience, to start having that personal connection, is a critical way to own your own audience, as opposed to renting it from somebody else like Facebook or Google Ads or whoever else. That's really what you want to invest in as soon as possible.
You're working on your third book now, or beginning to. Are you able to tell us anything about it? And where can we kind of follow you to stay in the loop and hear about it when it's ready?
Yeah, so you're very welcome to come join me on my website, Nir and Far. Nir is spelled like my first name, so N-I-R, nirandfar.com. And I can't tell you too much about the book. It's bad luck to talk about it before. But if you follow my writing on my blog, you'll see kind of tidbits of where I'm going with it. And I got time. I just published Indistractable in 2019. And as you said, my cadence tends to be about 5 years or so. I'm looking for that question that, I just can't find an answer to. So I haven't quite nailed it down yet.
Well, I highly recommend that everyone hop over to Nir and Far. Nir is someone you want to be following. He does great work and your life will only get better for it. And for now, let me say thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I think everyone got a lot of value and we're so grateful.
Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the great questions.
Well, thank you for all the work you're doing.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for being here tonight.